for the chambers. I believe we still have. Yeah. I believe we still have Councillor Burko and Councillor Quayle online.
Correct.
So we'll reconvene the meeting. Thank you, everybody, for working hard to get through that first agenda item. So now we're on item number 5. This is on page 18 of your agenda. Gosh, we're 2 hours in and we're on page 18. So this is the occupation charges within the coastal marine area. And we've got, well, I'll let you introduce it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is again related to the coast and the work we've been doing on the regional coastal plan review. However, it is able to be made as a separate decision, separate to the discussion we've had up until now. This is not a new topic. We have introduced it. We have canvassed this matter at the last, sorry, not the last 2, but definitely 2 or 3 workshops. As indicated at those workshops, we do need a formal decision from Council. So that's what we're seeking here, Madam Chair. And we have David Ambrose in the hot seat again. And sorry, Madam Chair, I did hear Councillor McPherson said he was happy to move.
Yes. Did someone want to second that, or do we want to hear a little bit more? Councillor Kneebone has seconded. Oh, sorry. Was that a second?
Yeah, you have to second it. We've seen this report before, haven't we? Or has it been changed slightly?
Madam Chair, you have not seen it in this report form. You have seen it in discussion form as part of 3 workshops.
I recognised a lot of it when I was reading it, so look, I'm happy to take it as read.
All right. Did you want to make any comments? Or are you happy for me to?
I'm happy, Madam Chair, for you to move. We do have a couple of slides, but I am conscious that there have been a couple of workshops that have discussed this item previously.
Okay. Happy to go? Yep. All right. We have a mover and a seconder. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Do you want that recorded? Councillor Tagg opposed. Is there anybody else opposed? Sorry, I didn't see. Nope. All right. The motion passes. Look at that. Making up time. Fantastic. 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I'll just say to David, thank you, David, and
yes,
we'll be in touch this afternoon. But thank you very, very much.
Good stuff. All right. So now, I believe we've got Valerie.
Yes.
Oh, there she is. So now we are on item 6. This is page 43. The Waikato Regional Council submission to the Transforming Recycling in New Zealand consultation document. Did you want to introduce?
Madam Chair, I would invite Brent as the director who's across this one to perhaps say a few words of introduction. Brent, you'll need a microphone.
Very brief. Good morning, councillors. Good to see you all. I think you all have met Valerie. Valerie's talked before about our waste strategy organisationally, and I know that a number of you have been very supportive and assisted Valerie as she's being about continuing to prepare that. Part of that is ensuring that we hear her voice at government level when new waste proposals are put in place. You'll hear in a minute from Valerie that this predominantly impacts on territorial authorities, but useful for us to support work that is achieving the objectives of our waste strategy about the circular economy and waste minimisation. So with that, I will hand over to Valerie.
Thank you. So there should be slides as part of the slides for this. Okay.
Just tootle through the presentation. William will tell you when to stop. Going. Oh, you're going the other way, mate, if you can. There we go.
There you go.
Thank you.
Good, everyone. Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Tracy. So as Brent said, MFE is consulting on a submission, it's called Transforming Recycling, but it goes beyond that. So I'll take the report and the submission as read, and we are seeking endorsement of the content of the submission and subsequent lodgement. So the submission, MFE is proposing the establishment of a container return scheme, or CRS, improvements to residential curbside recycling, separation of business food scraps, and as well requiring all urban areas of 1,000 people or more to have food scraps collection. I'll just briefly touch on those so we make sure that everyone understands exactly what they are. So you may be familiar that New Zealand actually had a CRS in, I think, the 80s. So it's basically, if you have a beverage container, there is a deposit on that. So when you bring it to a refund area, or when you buy your bottle, you pay extra. When you bring it back, you get that money back. So that's the basics of a container return scheme. It would be considered a product stewardship scheme as well. In terms of improving curbside recycling, there is a large amount of variation across the country about what councils take what items and in what state. And so the idea is that if we standardize that across the country, then we can improve the contamination and recycling and make things a lot easier for people. Separation of business food waste. So that's when business would be required to separate, and I realized that business can mean a lot of things. So we asked for a definition of business. So how big a business has to be to qualify under this, but basically separating their organics from landfill or recycling, and how that's processed could be in a variety of ways. It could be from composting on site to being collected as part of the Territory Authority rollout, or it could be feeding scraps to animals, that kind of thing. It means quite a few things. And then importantly, requiring all urban areas of 1,000 people or more to have food scraps collection. So it's not clear if that would be entirely a council rollout or if there might be community opportunity for that as well. But it's quite a big submission, and that's what we're talking about. So if you go to the next slide. So this is part of MFE's broader work program on waste prevention. So you recall in November that we submitted on New Zealand's waste legislation. What we're submitting on now is largely in alignment with that. So we brought up the point that organics, so that's both food scraps and green waste, represent a huge amount of divertible potential. So across the country, it's nationwide, MFE is calculated about 22%, but in our region, it's more, and territory authorities might find a higher percent in what's going into residential curbside. We also recommended that capital and operational funding be made available for territory authorities, so that way it's not put on the ratepayer to pay for these new services. And we also recommended that regulation was applied to single-use packaging products, so that falls both within the container return scheme and the other pieces that are going into their work program, such as banning hard-to-recycle plastics. So if you go to the next slide. So basically, why would you want to put these things in place? It's to increase diversion. So in terms of a container return scheme, we want beverage containers make up a large portion of the litter that we see across the country. So we want to decrease litter and increase diversion by having a container return scheme. There's a lot of contamination in recycling. So we want to decrease contamination and increase the quality of recycling that we're sending out. And in terms of food scraps and organics collection and processing, we want to increase the diversion, which has huge possibilities for waste and for climate as well. And we want to reduce emissions. So that's, we have a short amount of time, so I won't get too far into the detail, but I welcome any questions on that. So if you go to the next slide. So overall, we support what MFE is proposing in terms of establishing a CRS, national standardization of recycling, and mandatory diversion of food scraps. As you noted, this connects with what we've submitted on it in the past. It's also in alignment with our waste prevention action plan. So to formulate this submission, we collaborated with our territorial authority partners through what's now being called the Central North Island Waste Liaison Group. So that's made up of waste officers across our region, Bay of Plenty, and a few outlying territorial authorities as well. So that comes under Focus Area 1, which is around collaboration and partnerships from our Waste Prevention Action Plan. And then Focus Area 3 is on advocacy and legislation. So this submission very much falls within what we said we were going to do. If you go to the, oh, sorry, no, stay there. So one of our recommendations is that we support all decision-making to refer to the waste hierarchy. So when MFE is going through these decision-making, we want everything to refer to the higher end of the waste hierarchy, which is going to deal with the problem rather than mitigating the solution. Sorry, mitigating having a lesser quality outcome. So if you go to the next slide. So one of our recommendations is that, and this is the feedback that we've had from our territorial authority partners, is that what is presented in curbside needs to be consistent in what is in the container return scheme. But at the moment, because there's no standardization across the country in terms of what goes into curbside recycling, there's a lot of confusion, and our TA partners felt like if there was inconsistency between what goes in curbside and what goes in the container return scheme, there would be more confusion and a potential for contamination. So I actually would like to recommend one slight change to the submission that I put forward. And there's been a lot of debate on whether or not milk containers should be included or not included in the container return scheme. And overwhelmingly, the expression from the Zero Waste Network has been that milk should be included, so there is consistency across the two. So I would actually recommend that we change that. So originally we said that because milk containers have a high capture rate in recycling, it could be exempt, but we actually want to include that to have consistency across the two.
Sorry, Madam Chair, Valerie, where would that, you'll identify where that change is to be made in the submission?
Yep.
Thank you.
If you go to the next slide. So we have raised that we've got some concerns around timelines, and that is largely from the feedback that we've had from our TA partners. So in terms of timelines, these need to be realistic with council processes. It's not clear from the submission how putting these things in place is going to align with LTP processes and getting budgets. It's also not clear where the budget's going to come for a lot of these things. So we've requested that rather than, so there's two timelines proposed. One is having some of these things in place by 2025, and that's too short. They've requested that measurements go in by 2030, specifically around rolling out organics collection. So overall, we've raised the point that timelines need to be realistic. We've also requested that local government have a presence to guide the implementation of all these measures. Specifically, it was proposed that the managing board for the container return scheme be a nonprofit industry-led board, but we are saying that local government needs to have representation because local government deals, no matter what, local government deals with curbside, and there's a relationship between the container return scheme and curbside. So we've requested that local government be included on the development and the rollout of all these schemes. And then there's huge opportunity for regional councils to provide coordination and research to accelerate the activity in their region, as we already do. And if you go to the next slide, I can provide some examples of how we're doing that. So in alignment with our Waste Action Plan Focus Area 2, fostering research and innovation, we're a bit ahead, I think, as a region, because we're currently doing a project called the Circularizing Organics Project. So that's broken up into three parts. It's looking at collections and processing options for territory authorities and community in terms of organics. It's looking at eliminating contaminants, which is something that no one's doing at the moment. So we know that there's both chemical and physical contaminants in food waste or food scraps and organics processing in general. So we want to figure out how to get them out before we end up with a huge problem. And then we also need to understand the market. So what we've seen is, for example, in Christchurch, they had a successful food scraps collection, organics collection, but they had ended up with a big mountain of compost, which ends up having issues with leachate and that kind of thing. So we need to make sure that we have a high quality product, that product has a place to go, and that we have secure collections and processing options for both TAs and community. So I'll just highlight that part of what we're going to look at is the business case for iwi Māori business and for community as well. So we want to make sure that we're not presenting one option, but we're looking at all the options and what they could be. So I know there were some questions around reuse systems as well with the submission. Something that we're looking at for the next financial year is also to look at reuse systems, what's currently happening in the country, outside the country, and what we could do to help implement those. So I don't know, to your question, I don't know everything that's happening quite yet, but that would fall under that project. And then I also know there was a question around endorsing certain businesses in our submission, and we're not intending to endorse certain businesses in the submission. We just want to highlight the fact that these things are going in place, but we don't know very much about them. So yeah, I welcome any questions. Thanks.
Right. Councillor Husband.
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering, as a region, like, no matter what yap goes on in this room, billions of tonnes of animal feed is brought into this region a year. No matter what we say here, that's going to happen, right? Because we need to feed animals. So we used to, businesses used to keep food scraps aside and feed animals with it. And that's what used to happen. And then we brought in these restrictions and bylaws and different things. Why, I just, rather than having this big problem of compost heaps and all that with leachate, why aren't we just going back to that? Why aren't we just advocating that let's use this for animal feed again? You know, hey, we tried something, we made a mistake. Let's retry it again, especially in the pig industry. You know, so yeah, it's just and I understand there was concerns that people were stocking up mountains of stuff outside businesses, but not really the case. You know, like the case would be that they would take it daily. You know, so yeah, I've never been able to understand why we, you know, no matter how good we try and be, we've got to feed animals. So you know, there's billions of tonnes of feed brought into the Waikato every year from Indonesia, right? So that's the reality of the world. So why aren't we trying to use this? You know what I mean? Or advocate to use this. That's all. I just
Yeah,
interested
absolutely.
in your
And I don't
answer
have an answer to that other
what
than
your thoughts are on it.
Yeah. Other than, well, I think there's an opportunity for it. We have to see why it was. My understanding is that there's some restrictions from MB, but I don't totally understand why. But we're going to be looking at those kind of issues from the.
And that's why I was wondering if we could, you know, in the submission, we could actually open up the avenue to at least look at it.
Yeah.
You know,
So
why have we?
You might note that when MFE specified that separation of business food waste would be going in, they did say that one potential would be feeding food scraps to animals. So I think that that's something that we're all kind of looking at when we look at the issue.
I mean, for us to emphasise that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You know, like in the submission that, hey, that's a great idea. We'd like to see that again, or
Yep.
you know, whatever we think. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Councillor White.
Thank you. Great stuff, Valerie. Really like what you're doing. I just have a few questions. One of them is just in terms of page 44 with the product stewardship, we're in number 13. Just wondered, are batteries included in the product stewardship scheme for electrical and electronic things?
So from memory, I think that they are coming under the proposed product stewardship schemes that will be coming out, but they don't come under this submission in particular.
Right.
Yeah, so I think it's, I'll probably get it wrong, but tires, food packaging, agricultural containers, e-waste and batteries. Yeah, I think that all comes under what's going to be rolled out in the next few years from MFA.
That's good. I just had another couple of questions. So one of them was, are they going to sort of apply this across both urban and rural collections in terms of, so they definitely are going to do that? Because I mean, there are quite a few issues in the rural area that would be quite different, I would imagine, to urban, and might be a little bit more difficult to iron out. But is that the intention, that they will apply it to rural as well?
So what has been stated in the consultation is that a settlement of 1,000 people or more. So if, there needs to be some clarification about the support that's going to go in to help rural areas, because you're exactly right that the issues in terms of population density are going to put different pressures on a system. So that part needs to be developed more. And we don't know everything, but they're saying that populations of 1,000 people or more, so including rural.
Yeah. And my only other question, I don't know whether the submission is the right place for it, but I guess I'd just like to raise it anyway. In the past, I've always been the first person who's supported recycling of things like PETs, and have bought clothing, etc., that have been made out of it. But of course, it's later become, it's become obvious that actually when you wash those kinds of things, that you end up with small amounts of plastics ending up in the water. So are they definitely looking at the unintended consequences of recycling some things? Are they definitely, they've got that in mind? I just want to make sure that we don't end up with unintended consequences which are just as bad or worse, if you know what I mean. So
yeah, absolutely. So that's why we are really advocating for MFE to make decisions based on the waste hierarchy. So that is, the idea is that you're going to eliminate waste in the first instance, and recycling is really important, but it actually comes in the lower half of the waste hierarchy. So what we want to do, exact to your point, is support what MFA is doing in terms of banning hard to recycle plastics. So that's going to eliminate some of that. And what we really want to see is high quality recyclable items going through that system to avoid some of those unintended consequences. Absolutely. But,
okay, thank you.
Sorry, so speaking order, I've got Councillor McPherson, Councillor Nicol, Councillor Quayle, Councillor Tagg. McPherson is up. Okay, so this is a speaking order. So Councillor Tagg, if I can get you to turn yours off.
Sure.
Speaking order is Councillor McPherson, Councillor Nicol, Councillor Quayle, and Councillor Tagg.
First of all, can I compliment you on the slide deck? I just wish when we get presentations from staff, they used infographics like you've just shown us, because you can get your head around it in a heartbeat. So thank you so much for thinking about us and our time, because I learned a lot from that slide deck. I've got a couple of questions. Where in your mind is the best example of proof of concept globally of where this has worked and they've ironed out the wrinkles? I was interested in the visual around the nappies. I didn't kind of understand the implication for nappies. In terms of Stu's comment about animal food, I get that. The only thing I would say is we would need to be careful with monogastrics, single stomach animals versus ruminants. We've got a waste to energy plant mooted for Te Awa Mutu, which is already stimulating huge debate. And I'm sort of wondering, in the back of our minds, I guess that's an RMA process that sits over there, and we've just got to forget about that and do what's best given the facts we've got at the moment. And the last thing was to Councillor White's question. Would it be possible for us to ask that you used her language in the submission? When you said it, and sorry, I didn't quite hear, but the chair's told me you said food hierarchy. Waste hierarchy, sorry. I'd really like to see the language that Councillor White used, because it's really elegant when you talk about unintended consequences. If you just rely on them drawing a line between a waste hierarchy and unintended consequences, there's a real risk they won't do that. So could we, Chair, through you, could we ask that you actually use that language in the submission so that there's no ambiguity around on unintended consequences. Thank you.
Councillor Nichol.
Thank-
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So when you are talking about an example of how, which item are you looking for in terms of a example? Container, yeah, proof of concept, container return scheme, food waste collection. So there's a number of models across the globe, and I think it's really important for us to look to those, but to develop ones that are going to suit our situation. And that's what our project, the Circularizing Organics project, aims to do. It aims to look at the different communities that we have. We're going to be doing quite a lot of consultation to see what the right fit is going to be. So, for example, in an urban area, so I can take examples from New Zealand. So in an urban area such as Hamilton, it makes sense to bulk and transport to Hampton Downs because of the population density. But then there's smaller communities. So for example, in our rural areas, which we have a lot of in our region, it might make more sense to have a community-based solution. So for example, in Raglan, it's a small scale hot composting unit, and that suits that community. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say, I would be very hesitant to say that there's one model that we should be looking towards. I think it depends on a variety of factors. So if it's rural, urban population, to Councillor Hudson's point, you need to look at, is it better in this situation to be feeding it the product to animals? There's also a variety of feedstocks as well, to your point. So there's food scraps, there's bio waste. So I'm not going to give you a quick and easy answer on that one. So apologies for that. But we are looking at what some of the options are, and one of the deliverables of that project is a decision-making matrix that's going to help our community make some of those choices. In terms of, so that I was just illustrating that there's a lot of contamination in recycling, and nappies is sometimes one of those things. So the image was just of recycling contamination. What was your third question?
It was a question about the waste to energy plant, and that's being sent to their in very early discussions in Te Awamutu.
I would say, in the interest of time, I'm sure myself and Blair would be more than happy to have a workshop with council about that. It is an RMA issue. It doesn't come under the submission, and I don't want to get distracted because I know there's quite a few questions, but I'd be more than happy to have another session about that.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Just interesting when you talk about like the community composting and unintended consequences, because isn't there an issue down at Christchurch with the community composting facility?
It's the wastewater treatment.
No, I thought there was a composting one that they're looking to move because there's been so many.
I don't think that's a community-based solution. I think that the issue is volume there. Yeah, so I don't think I think that's the council service.
Right, it is a council service, but they're now looking at having to shift it because there have been so many complaints
of odor.
About odor.
Yeah, absolutely.
Years.
So absolutely, and that's what we're aiming to do in the project that we're launching now, is get it right in the first instance, rather than having all of our TAs roll and all of our community roll things out and then have to deal with issues that come up. So that's why I think we have a huge opportunity, and as a regional council, to be doing that work. And I'm really trying to advocate for other regional councils to be doing this work as well.
Great. Now I do see, sorry, I'll come to you in a second, Councillor Nichol. I do see that there are some issues around sound online. So I don't know if maybe we'll just pitch into our mics a little bit better. Yeah, that might address it. Councillor Nicol.
Thank you. I've got 3 points to make, and thank you, Valerie. It's a really good submission. Enjoyed reading it. First point is, I think it's great that we're making the adjustment to include milk bottles. Do like that thinking around consistency. The second point is just to give some context to what Valerie had mentioned at the end of her introduction, because I saw an example in the submission of a reuse system. I had emailed her with 2 other examples that we could include, and they were the fact that Sinlay, who have a Pōkeno site, but are also based down in Dunsandel near Christchurch, they've been doing a stainless steel milk bottle return scheme and working with supermarkets on that, and that's a South Island thing where it's actually happening in market. But since they have a site up here as well, I thought it could also be included as just highlighting the fact that that is happening in case they aren't aware. And the second one was that Happy Cow Milk Company launched in the Waikato a few weeks ago or months ago, but it's a long story of where that's come from, and the concept around that is that especially small scale farmers have a large container that does a lot of the processing already for that fresh milk that can be delivered to local places, schools, cafes, etc. And so I think the other example was kind of like a vat/keg type of example, and I thought since it's in the Waikato we could also mention it. So just put it out there for happy for staff to decide whether that's appropriate. And then the last point was around point 46 and 47 of the submission was around timelines. And so we said for infrastructure, TAs that don't have suitable existing infrastructure, they should have until 2030, as you mentioned, and then those that did have until 2025. And we said, no, it's not enough time to meet the 2025 deadline. And I was just keen to ask Valerie the reasoning of why, or, I mean, in an ideal world, I would like to push the government to do these things faster and expect action faster on this. And I'll give you the reasoning, and that is, I mean, I immigrated to New Zealand when I was 8 years old, but I grew up in the southwest of Germany, and in the early 90s, it was absolutely standard to have all the stuff we're talking about right now. So I grew up with 4 wheelie bins with different coloured lids. It was the norm as a 5-year-old. I also grew up with, and it's still in place today, water bottles and other types of beverages get bought in a crate or individually and taken back to the supermarket. And those bottles go into a machine, which is quite fun when you're a little kid, and you get your money back and your little ticket, and then that ticket gets you your cash back when you've finished going around the supermarket. And those water bottles actually get washed, not recycled. So it's actually energy-wise really, really useful. So that's where I'm coming from with my thinking. Oh, by the way, even the shopping trolleys were a return scheme because you had to have like a 20-cent piece to put into it to actually unclip it from the other trolleys and then put it back, get it back when you've clipped it back in. So you didn't have shopping trolleys lying all over the place like sometimes can happen. But on that, I think it's all a matter of priority. There's no technical challenge to be overcome here. If the government is to provide the money, the resourcing for the manpower and the guidance, I think these things can be in place really quite rapidly. So I guess if we did ever argue differently, and I'm not saying that we should, because obviously it's an opinion from a whole lot of TAs coming together, then that would be because it would be caveated with if you give the resourcing to do it in time. Yeah. So my only action point on that would be if you could include the reasoning as to why it's not enough time or why it is enough time, then I think that'd be really good. And if you can put anything in there about advocating for the resourcing and that could happen faster, if you believe that's true, I'd love that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Quayle.
Yeah, I have a contrary view to Councillor Nicol. I think about unintended consequences. Our country is a very large land mass compared with the population. and one of the comments that I've heard is that milk bottles, for example, in Hamilton, are one of the best recycled elements. So those plastic milk bottles, I'm not talking about glass ones. Yes, you can have a container return scheme on that, but those milk bottles are one of the highest use. Now, to me, if we're now going to move to a container return scheme on that, we're opening up the whole area to a different unintended consequences. Milk is a fundamental food source, and if we add, let's say, and I understand it's going to be 10 or 20 cents or maybe more per bottle of milk, the well-being issues around that fundamental food source for deprived communities is potentially quite significant, particularly if they get a number of, if they have a lot of milk in a week. So I'm concerned about the fact that we do know that plastic milk bottles are recycled very high in Hamilton. That to me, I can't get my head around a container refund scheme. And then there's a naivety around thinking that government are going to come up and fund the money. All the indications that we've had to date on all sorts of things, from Three Waters to everything, is they are moving the cost to either the ratepayer or the people living in the region. So that's a concern. And I'd like to change the other point I would like to make is I'd like to change the way we have the narrative on the population of rural townships, putting in a food collection for 1,000 rural township or more. What I'd like to do there is that we would oppose it unless there is support, financial support, because those rural communities, the cost, again, of putting in a collection in a small community of, say, 1,200, 1,500 people, for food scraps is going to, I know a lot of those communities are actually pushing the likes of worm farms, composting so they're going to put in, pushing that, and then you're going to bring in a cost which says you have to pay for a food scheme if you've got 1,200 people in there. A scheme, even if you've got worm farms and composting in your own backyard. So those are concerns for me. So the first one is a container return scheme is a concern in terms of the cost of increase to a milk product for deprived communities, and I'm really concerned about that. I'd like other councillors to comment, please. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Barry. I certainly support your comments about the danger of pricing out a very nutritional food source out of reach of your average person. And also the challenges in small rural areas to financially afford, sustainably, I should say, afford to roll out these. All right. Where am I next? No, sorry.
Yeah, so what MFE has proposed that milk containers are out. So I'm welcome the comments from council, and if that particular issue, if we want to comment on milk containers are in or out. So MFE, for the reasons that you raised, being that there's high captures in recycling and that it is a food staple, have proposed that it's out, but the voice from the waste prevention sector is that they'd like to include it because you do get it does increase the cost of milk, you get the deposit back, and that it would mean that there's consistency across recycling in curbside and a container return scheme. So that's going to decrease confusion generally amongst the population. So I'm open to the debate on that. There's definitely been a lot of debate with the people that I've been working with. And then in terms of food scraps collection for rural populations, we have always advocated that this be subsidized. So we've advocated that the behaviors that we want to see be subsidized, and then the behaviors that we don't want to see cost more, basically. So with the waste levy increase, we think that there should be funding available for subsidization of food scraps collection. And that's what we have included in all of our submissions.
Right. I suppose that there's an interesting conundrum in terms of the deposit one pays for a container when living in a rural area, and then the price of fuel to drive to the collection point. That you might end up with some interesting economic dynamics out of that may not get the outcome you're after.
Yeah, and it's tricky to kind of mentally model that because some rural communities don't necessarily have even curbside recycling. So
I don't live that far out.
yeah, so you might have to drive
I even have
anyways
rubbish pickup.
to a transfer station anyways, so we are proposing that the container return scheme depots are accessible to people, so it makes it easy for them as well. So we're saying that a variety of options should be available. We should have them at supermarkets, we should have them at community centers, we should have them at transfer stations to that point, to make it easy for people. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is that we could debate. You can see either side, really.
All right. We've got, nice, you're ready. Look at that. You're celebrating. I'm coming to you. Hilton Tag.
Thank you. Well, just to Barry's point, I actually support the consistency of approach that does apply to milk bottles. I think the more simpler the scheme is, the better the public will adopt it. I take the point around people on low incomes, but they will actually receive the refund, so it'll come back to them. So that's my position on that. So I've got some suggestions relating to the submission. The first is that I'd like to see us actively supporting the submission these local community trusts and community groups running recycling centres. There's a really good examples already in Raglan and in Thames, and there's moves afoot, I know, on the Coromandel to do the same. And they provide local employment and sort of got skin in the game in their own community. There's not the profit motive. They actively encourage other forms of recycling other than what's contained in the submission. So I think it would be good if we showed support for that. I agree with Jennifer's point around the timelines. I think our submission over-eggs the difficulties. And I point to Hauraki District Council, which is a rural council, a rural community, and they've rolled out their scheme in about a couple of years. And I understand Thames Coromandel and maybe others are getting down that path already. So I'm not sure that pushing this out in some cases to 2030 is justified. I think we have to move with pace on this issue. The next point is, I'm wondering in terms of what could be added to curbside collection is small computers, laptops, iPads, tablets and smartphones. I realise there's a difficulty with big PCs and the e-waste that's contained in really large domestic appliances that you could fit in a bin on a laptop or a tablet. And I'll come as to why I think that's important. And that is that there's a criteria question in paragraph 38 as to I think what could be added there is the value of the recycled material, its scarcity or its difficulty to obtain in the first place, to mine or to extract from the environment. And the best example I can give of that is that a lot of that e-waste contains gold, and it's now been actively recycled. So the Waste Minimisation Fund has been used to fund a facility in Auckland, which is now taking e-waste in volume and extracting all the materials in those circuit boards that they find in computers. And part of that is they can actually extract precious metals. So I think that should be another criteria to add. And, I probably might even up the debate here, but I actually think that the limit should be 500 for a rural community rather than 1,000. Because, as I say, Hauraki District Council has been able to roll the scheme out in small towns and so on, which have that sort of population. So those are the suggestions I'm making. Thanks.
Councillor Tagg?
Can I just comment on one
Yes.
thing? The only one that I would oppose of that is e-waste and recycling. So e-waste is going to come under a separate product stewardship scheme. And there has been issues with collections and the batteries presenting a fire hazard. And so it's been quite a big issue. So anytime there's a battery or, any other kind of even aerosols in the trucks, it has created fire. So it's more of a health and safety issue. But there will be a product stewardship scheme for e-waste being rolled out by MFE.
That's very interesting. I suppose the other issue with putting your old laptop in the recycling bin is information security.
Just on that facility,
That's if somebody doesn't come along and pick it up out of your bin before they pick it up. I'm just too suspicious. That's what it is. I'm suspicious. All right. Okay. I've got, I know Councillor White wants to speak again. I'm going to go to Councillor Kneebone because he hasn't spoken yet. All right.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I'm generally supportive of the submission. Just in response to Barry's comments about cost, I get all that, and it is really important. And there's a real tension here between where the cost of this should lie. And the reality is it's just been too easy for suppliers of food and beverages to use packaging, including milk bottles and that, without having to face any responsibility for the cost of life of that packaging, and so until we start doing something like this, we don't start having the conversations as a country as to where those costs should lie. And so, for example, at the moment, there's just no incentive on the domestic milk supply industry, regardless of which part of the chain the responsibility should lie, to provide their product in containers that are sustainable, and for a woman family with 4 or 5 teenage kids drinking gallons of milk, it's ridiculous that you've got to buy. I hate to imagine how many. I mean, when we were kids, we had a 20-litre drench container in the fridge with all our milk in it, and a tap on it. Yeah, and look, I think in terms of smaller communities versus big ones, we just simply have to roll these sort of processes out in the big ones first. That seems absolutely logical. Food waste collection in rural communities. It's go and bury in a garden, but people have forgotten how to do all that stuff, eh? Yeah, and my understanding was, I remember when I went to Germany in 2007, market, and I was always told when I got back and started asking questions, it was that they had the economies of scale over there to roll it out a lot quicker than what we did. But we're probably never going to have the economies of scale that they've got, so we've still got to, doesn't mean we shouldn't walk away from the problem and keep on doing what we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I've got, coming back to Kathy, because we've also got Councillor Strange who would like to speak. Barry is saying he's still having sound problems. Not sure why you're having sound problems. I don't know anything we can do. But keep putting in the chat, Barry, if it's an issue, if you think it's proximity to the mic, let me know and I'll keep reminding people. All right, Councillor Husband.
It's just to Barry's point, and I agree with sort of what he's saying in respect, I'm listening to everyone, you know, I know what Stu's saying as well. But we've got to be careful when we make these decisions that our actions don't cause a reaction. And at the end of the day, the consumer pays. Make no mistake, Fonterra won't pay, the dairy farm won't pay, consumer will pay. So everyone knows the world hunts protein at the moment. Milk prices are already going to skyrocket in the next year. We know that, that's coming. You know, they're probably going to double in the next year. So I have concerns that when you grow up, like in Japan, Germany and all that, that's the countries that I've been to, you know, and seen those systems, when you grow up with that system, just like Jen, you grow up with that system, almost that's your system. So I agree, the next generation of Kiwis would be really good at it. But this generation right here is going to be really bad at it. So I don't think they're going to take the time out of their day to go and get their 20 cents for their milk container. Whereas once it's indoctrinated and it's part of your everyday, I don't know. I get concerned that it's going to target the wrong people. So people are just going to pay the extra 20 cents and throw the bottle in the bin. You know, like, is that what's really going to happen in the real world? I don't know. You know, like in New Zealand, I'm only saying. I know overseas they're really good at it. But I'm just interested. Yeah, like I just get concerned that the cost is going to come back onto consumers, you know, like for all of this sort of great plans that we have. So, and it's just going to become an affordability issue for protein source in our own country. You know what I mean? It's so, yeah, I don't know. It's a bit of a hard one because I agree with you, Jen. Those systems work really well, you know. But would this generation of Kiwis actually do it? I don't know. Yeah, I know. I understand that to start it, but to actually make it, that's the only option. You know what I mean? It's like and putting that cost back onto the consumer. But I say hit the companies, hit the Fonterras, hit the OCDs, and say start using milk bottles again that you can wash and clean, and that would be my number one thing, is that you can wash and clean and keep using. They've gone to those plastic bottles and Tetra Pak for ease, but it's creating a mountain of waste. But surely we can go back to them and say, hey, we need you to go back to the bottles and start cleaning them again. You know, I don't think. Yeah. That's where the conversations, I believe, need to happen. Stop the waste in the first place, right at the company. Yeah.
And once again, though, in terms of unintended consequences, you go back to glass, and the transport costs are going to increase. And like you say, somebody's paying. Somebody's paying. All right, Councillor Strange.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, interesting discussion so far. So yeah, thank you, everyone. Yeah, I agree that, you know, we do need to start somewhere and putting that cost back onto promoting product stewardship is certainly a step in the right direction. Yeah, I mean, I remember the milk truck coming around every evening, you know, you have your glass bottles out with your tokens. Yeah, I would love for that to come back. I will soon have 4 teenagers, and we already go through a 2 litre of milk every day. So yeah, fresh milk every evening would be lovely. Yeah, I also remember walking down roads, picking up aluminium cans to make a bit of extra money. You know, you pick up litter, other people's trash is your treasure, and then cashing that in for yourself. So, you know, that's another option that could promote a little bit of extra cash for someone also. Yeah, I do acknowledge though that if it, you know, that initial cost of purchase, if you are putting it straight onto the milk purchase, then it's going to hurt people. So yeah, bit of tension in the interim, I think, but yeah, step in the right direction though. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor White, did you want to make another comment? We can be very quick. We're well over time on this item, so.
Yeah, okay. So what I've decided is I won't talk about the thing that I was going to talk about. I'll just have a conversation offline because I don't think that probably isn't within the scope of this submission, but it's something I'd like to talk to you about. So,
Absolutely.
so yeah, that's fine.
All right. I suppose from my point of view, I would like a greater reflection of the challenge that is faced in this region because of our extensive rural population. There are the catchment for towns is much broader, I think, than we necessarily take stock of. And while there's great intention in this, I think that we need to be stronger in our position around the unintended consequences, which have been raised by a number of counselors here today. And particularly if there is a scheme that is going to add cost on what I personally believe is one of the most nutritious food sources that is available. I would say that though, wouldn't I? I think that we need to, again, there's the unintended consequences of costs for a dairy product for people to have access to, as opposed to, say, a soft drink that does not have the nutritional qualities. And we don't want to institute regimes that are counterproductive to some of the other conversations we have in our wider society about access to nutrition and nutritional choices being able to be made by individuals. The other point I guess I would like to raise, and this is on page 54, and it's the answer to question 9, the first bullet point. I see where we say, and I recognize that the question is regards to milk, but we say we'd like to see the dairy industry take responsibility for the cost of their products at end of life through product stewardship. I think that we have established that product stewardship is something that this council advocates for, and I think that is we advocate for that regardless of the industry. So, so I would be supportive of that, saying that we'd like to see all industries take responsibility for the cost of their products at end of life through product stewardship. I think that aligns with the consensus that we have arrived at as a council prior to this. All right, we ready to go?
Yeah, Madam Chair, we've got the comments down, we've got the benefit of the recording so we can go through it. I guess just from hearing the conversation, it would assist Valerie, Brent and I in finalising the submission, getting some guidance on the milk containers in or out, because I've heard some speak for and some speak against. So for us to include that in our submission, whether they are part or are not part of the issues we want to raise in the submission would help us. And if we can't reach a consensus to give us guidance, then at least we can identify that as a contentious point that was discussed around the table. But for us to reflect what the feeling is of the majority of councillors.
So are you looking for a raise your hand if?
I haven't got a clear direction from the majority.
Sure. All right, so the question is milk containers being included
In a container return scheme.
in the container return scheme. So those who are in favor of milk containers being included? Sorry?
Will be part of the container return scheme.
So you're
included in, yeah.
In favor
Yeah.
of milk containers being included in the container return scheme? In favor? So we've got, can I get clear what? So we've got Councillor White, Councillor Strange, Councillor Hodge, Councillor Nebo, Councillor Nicol, Councillor Remington, Councillor Tagg, and Councillor McPherson. I'm not sure.
That gives me a majority indication.
And was that a majority? Okay, I'm just registering. I'm against that because of the, I think that we're sending mixed messages around opportunity to access nutrition. Yes.
Point of clarification. So that's going to be the only scheme available to get your money back that you've paid your extra 40 or 50 cents for on your milk bottle.
So all beverages under, I think, 3 liters would be included in this.
So you're lumping milk in with Coca-Cola.
That's what they're proposing, in or out of CRS.
We support that, this council. Okay, cool.
But I think we will note that was unanimously supported. All right. Okay, we've got our usual submission motion, which is receiving the report and then delegating to myself and Director May to incorporate the comments. We have a mover and a seconder. All those in favor? Opposed? Would you like that recorded?
What we can do is we can say there was support for milk to be included, but there's concerns over any kind of penalty towards nutritional products. We can make that distinction because, yeah.
Great.
So Madam Chair,
Yeah,
No.
we can raise that point. Yeah.
sorry Madam Chair, that was just to get the direction on that matter. We've captured all the other matters, particularly around the nutritional value and the cost imposition on the people who will feel it the most. So that will all be incorporated in the submission.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, I can tell you we're never going to get to lunch here, so I hope everybody's just got
one more
some
question.
stores to draw
Sorry,
on.
Madam Chair, did we get a mover and seconder?
Yes, we did have a mover and a
Okay.
seconder, and it was.
And I just have one
passed.
question and one clarification point. It was raised that the population for rolling out food scraps collection be 500 people rather than 1,000. Is that, are we putting that forward as well?
I didn't hear, I did hear that idea floated, but I didn't hear people piping up,
Okay.
reinforcing that. so.
Yeah.
All right, great. Moving on.
Okay, Madam Chair, thanks Valerie, that's all done, wonderful.
Yes,
We'll
thank you.
tidy that submission up. Madam Chair, we now move on to page 69 of the agenda, which is the draft national adaptation plan. So we've been waiting studiously for this. It was released last week, late last week, which was, I think, Blair, probably a week after we had anticipated it. This is a pretty seminal document. What we are doing here today is just giving you an overview. We have scheduled in a workshop and the matter will be going to a submissions subcommittee, I think the 25th of May, it just came through. So yes, the 25th of May, which is the day before Zone 2. So this is a significant matter. It has been a culmination of a lot of work, will continue to be a lot of work and will influence the way the country does business going forward. There is a lot of conversations in the media, not only the release of this plan, not only RMA reform, local government reform, our very own coastal plan, the work done at Wharekawa and Kaiawa, TCDC and on our west coasts. But what Blair's going to do is just give you an overview, sow some seeds in your mind, and then we will have a workshop so we can get feedback, and then it will go to submission subcommittee so that we can meet the deadline for lodgement. So, Madam Chair, over to Blair. He's got, said to Blair, about a 10-minute presentation, hitting the high points. You will see more councillors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, it's here at last. William, could we have the first slide, please? For the last 18 years, local government has been at the forefront of climate adaptation. Legislation has required the sector to have particular regard to the effects of climate change when exercising functions and duties under the Resource Management Act, and it looks like that.
The slide that is orange
without the scroll.
19, I can't read it.
That's
Thank
it.
you, Andrew.
That's it. Cool. Thank you. And this is we've been doing this for 18 years now, nearly 2 decades, since 2004. And this is the first time we've seen anything that's approached national direction in the climate adaptation phase. There was guidance for sea level rise in 2017, but this is quite, as Tracy mentioned, quite a new thing. Next slide, please. I'll quickly skip, conscious of the time, I'll quickly skip through the context and then talk about the plan, but would just like to refresh you that at the end of last year, the IPCC did make the conclusion that we have left the climate, that all our social, cultural, economic systems have developed upon, and that's the reason that we are needing to adapt, because things have changed. Next slide, please. And you'll be familiar with this diagram, but this localises the changes that can be expected over the coming century for the Waikato region. And we also yesterday have had the publication of the sea rise work, which identifies the differential changes between coastal land and sea level rises, showing that it's rising a lot faster on the west coast than in some east coast areas. Next slide, please. Adaptation is really a transition. Ideally, we want to be in situation A, where we live and our economy uses resources that is within the ecological environmental limits of commonly called planetary boundaries. But sometimes we exceed these, our economy gets too big and we overshoot and we end up with polluted waterways or dried up waterways because we've allocated it in the wrong amounts. But at other times, and this is what we're facing here, the climate changes beneath us. And so going back to that statement from the IPCC, what we do, the way we live our life, has been rationally developed on the resources that we have had at hand. They've changed. They've moved on. We don't get the same amount of water as we used to get. We get it differently as well. So we have a water-based economy. It is really critical that we need to adapt, transform our economy, and build resilient communities. It's a process. It's not something that we reach nirvana at stage C. It's not in our lifetimes. This is something that we will be working on forever now. It's a transition. Please, next slide. So now moving on to the adaptation plan, and just like to highlight the purpose, and that is to enable New Zealanders to prepare for and adapt to the impacts of climate change. Next slide. The draft plan, this is it here, has been developed by the New Zealand government, and that is the intention that, but it's also based upon a national climate risk assessment, which was completed in August 2020, and the legislation in the Climate Change Response Act requires the Adaptation Act to be prepared 2 years after, within 2 years of that. So it's coming out in August this year as a final one. This is part of the engagement process, but it is based on that science-driven and national risk assessment of August 2020. In the future, that work will be prepared by the Climate Change Commission, and then it will be the government's role to prepare the adaptation plan. So this just shows and highlights the relationship over time, 6 yearly increments or additions of the National Adaptation Plan, how it's based on a similarly timed risk assessment, and also there will be opportunities for 2 yearly updates. So it is a dynamic process. Next one, please. The contents of the plan. The plan focuses on 3 key areas. One is to reform the institutions to be fit for a changing climate. And this is quite topical for all of us at the moment. It integrates many of the government's reforms, which when you see them just coming at you, they might not seem to have a structure, but this is really quite interesting, and it's quite a good integrator. It requires the reforms that are going on at the moment to be able to adapt to this changing climate. And particularly the reforms we have an interest in is the infrastructure pipeline announced recently, the RM system reforms. Adaptation depends on this, particularly with the Climate Adaptation Act, obviously, but with the regional spatial strategies to identify those areas that are increasingly to be at risk from a climate. The NPS freshwater reform, we've invested heavily in that in the last decade really, but particularly in the last few years, and that really picks up the low flow side of a changing climate, particularly low waters and droughts, and the way we allocate access to water for both discharges and takes. The National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity, our Indigenous biota has to adapt as well, and it doesn't do that very cleverly if it's happening faster than generation cycles, and also if there's massive amount of concrete in the way. I'm thinking Kauri in Northland, how does it get south if it needs to? It's not going to happen without some active work on our part. Pest species, they're going to be some advantaged, some disadvantaged by a changing climate as well. Three waters, one of the critical reforms for infrastructure and services that is going to be affected by a changing climate, both again for allocations to take water and to discharge treated wastewaters. And not just that, but the location of the infrastructure serving communities that are at risk. And of course, local government reform, the machinery of local government and co-governance mechanisms. And this relates not, that's just what we're interested in as a party to this, but it also affects other operators across government and their strategies and policies. So it's quite far-reaching. Next slide, please. This is the way it's structured. It's typical public policy design 101. What's the problem? Where do you want to be? How are you going to get there? And what else do you need to think about? And it has some case studies. Next slide, please. This just identifies some of the opportunities we have with exercising our powers and functions to make it easy for communities to adapt and become more resilient in the face of a changing climate. Next slide, please. And finally, last one, the timeline. The draft National Adaptation Plan is open for consultation until 3 June. As Tracy said, it was a bit late, and the report you have in your agenda was written before we received it, and it was on the best advice that I had for the consultation period, and it's wrong. Sorry, 3 June is when we have to have that done. MFE will be holding workshops for local government, recognising the significance of the sector on 10th and 17th of May. And as Tracy recognised, and again, since the preparation of this slide, you now know when the submission subcommittee will meet, and we will have an opportunity to hear your points and your thoughts on the draft advice. Final plan is published in August 2022 each year, and after the 30th of November, we will be required to have regard to it in our policy statements and plans when reviewing and changing them. So, and that is actually the same level of involvement that our policies and plans will have to have with the National Emissions Reduction Plan, and that comes out this month in concert with the budget. So climate change is going to be something that you're going to need to consciously have regard to in your decisions. And as I mentioned, government will have the opportunity to adjust it every 2 years, so that we can make the changes necessary of changing information. And
Great.
I'd like to leave it there
Good stuff.
and
Thank
listen to you now. Thank you.
Nice. Councillor Remington.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I'm happy to move the recommendations. The question I have, Blair, thanks for the nice succinct way in which you presented today. And one would have to be blind Freddy not to realise the massive changes in the climate change that's in the world and this country. I just chatting to Dennis over tea this morning in the Herald, quite startling kind of many people regarding climate change and how it's going to affect our coastlines. They were talking about kind of the east coast being vulnerable, particularly the North Island. I think that was down to the movement in regard to the plates of the earth. But, you know, when I was up in the Coromandel, I just see kind of erosion. It's just sort of a massive level, particularly on the Coromandel Peninsula on both sides, whether it's be Brophy's Beach or up where Andrew lives. You know, it just seems to be eroding before your eyes. So the question I have on with two questions, El Nino or La Nina, does any of those affect the east or the west coast, or is it equally? Is it both because it's coming down from the tropics, warmer seas, etc.? Is there any difference between east and west? And the second, I need clarification from the esteemed reports from those scientists that came out yesterday, whereas you're kind of reflecting more is going to be on the west. They're talking about more the east coast. I'm talking about erosion on the coastline.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'm not a coastal geomorphologist. I need to take my understanding from peer-reviewed reports and the like. This, I mentioned just in passing the New Zealand sea rise thing. Yes, I've seen the articles in the Herald. My interpretation of that, the figure diagram was that there was some pretty significant differences between east and west coast, but you mentioned the weather patterns and erosion. This is new information about the differential rise of the land in relation to the sea level that's also already rising. I don't have any specific additions to add to your comments.
Great, thanks, Councillor Remington, and thank you for the response. Councillor Tagg.
Thanks. I suppose what I'd like to see in terms of any briefing we have before we make a submission is what are the impacts in a regional way. So, you know, where are the hot spots in terms of, you know, our need to respond. And if I just pick out what's already been talked about, sea level rise. We've had this report come out in the last few days, and what that does is identify at 2 kilometre spaces around the entire New Zealand coastline what the vertical land movement is. So, and what that's showing us, for example, is that the stop banks that protect the Hauraki Plains, there is some level of subsidence there, which then has implications for us as an organisation. You know, will they last as long as we thought they would? And then for Thames, you know, this is quite half the time in which we have to respond. And already, even if you take out vertical land movement, there's present day extreme risk. So if you add in land subsidence, it's super extreme risk. So I think we need some sort of feedback around, you know, where are the areas that, from a regional perspective, we really need to be concerned about on that issue. And just to give you an example, the Shoreline Management Project has come up with some suggestions for hard protection between Kopu and Te Puru with a price tag of $623 million. Now that's all in one rating ward of the Thames Coromandel. So it's clearly unaffordable to local ratepayers. But one of the gnarly issues we have to address, I think, in our submission is what proposals do we have in terms of how all this sort of adaptation work is funded, and what consideration do we give to equity issues? Like if you bought a property in the last 5 years, you knew sea level rise was happening. If you bought one 20 years ago, maybe you didn't. So how do we treat those different approaches? So those are some of the things I'd like to see in our submission.
Through you, Madam Chair, that is exactly the types of feedback that is being sought in this. That's I just brought it to you as the draft adaptation plan. It is accompanied by a discussion on managed retreat as well. There's about 72 questions. 20 of those questions, the last 20, are specifically in relation to managed retreat, and that recognises that in some situations that will be what is needed.
Yes.
And it's about funding of that, and that is what the business of the Climate Adaptation Act, the third part of the RM system reforms, but it's delayed a year into next parliamentary term. So what they're asking for now is feedback on that, concurrent with the draft adaptation plan, so that will inform the legislative design of that act. Yeah. So we will have that opportunity. But what I took from what you were saying is you'd like to know where are the hotspots, and that's something that we can bring to you, because that is a piece of work that has already been brought to the Climate Action Committee.
Great. Now, as I just focus us, we will have a workshop on this prior to the submission subcommittee. Is that correct?
Yeah, Madam Chair, it is intended to have a workshop so that you can understand more rather than just the few slides Billy's popped through today, and then it'll be taken to the submission subcommittee 25th of May. We also have a workshop scheduled in for Thames Coromandel Shoreline Management Plan, so it makes sense we do them the same day because there are some significant real life issues there. We'll have a chat to Tash and see how that works for you.
I hope nobody had anything else planned for May. That's what I'm hearing today.
We're all workshops, we're all workshops.
Just camp out here, bring a cot, it's all good. So just wanted to make sure we reiterated the process going forward, so we can hopefully move through this this item. Jen, did you want to speak? You were up.
Thanks. No, it was just seconding what you've just said and to say that it'd be great to also get an update on the local climate change risk assessment work whenever that workshop is held, because I'm mindful that the surveys are going out today. And just as a heads up for everyone, you'll probably see that in your inboxes later today. So it's a fairly generic survey, but it has gone out to a lot of stakeholders, or is going to get their inputs on what they see as risks locally in their area and wearing their hats. So just a quick verbal update during that workshop would be great.
Great.
Sorry, Madam Chair, there is another piece of the puzzle. I don't have the term right at my fingertips, but there is also a submission that Council has called for on natural hazards and insurance bill that they are looking at. So that is also another part of the puzzle that will pop together without getting too much into the insurance business, because that's not what we're about, but definitely about risk and liability and who pays. That is definitely what we're about.
Councillor Mahuta, did you have?
Oh, no, just thank you for the work, Blair. Just noting that Koihakena and Raglan, Okapu and Aotea, Marakopa and Maketu and Kawhi are all maraes that are working on their strategies in and about the coastal inundation. So if any of those can be helpful, let me know. And just two other things. If in the workshop we could talk about where we are now on climate as a council and where we will be going to under this adaptation policy, just to give it a sense of direction, not the detail. How we'll address unfunded mandates in this space, Because if it, well, because 2 years is shorter than our planning time, Maine. So if we've got to make a rugged change every 2 years, I just want to know we have the right funding mechanism to do that. And just how we enable our vulnerable communities to do their assessments. Whoever they are. Thank you.
Madam Chair, why I smiled and giggled then was if anyone heard both Minister Shaw and the Prime Minister on the national radio yesterday sidestepping the question around funding. I did hear local government mentioned an awful lot and tried not to drive off the new bit of the expressway as I heard that. It is a big issue. Who pays, when, how, and how it's done equitably, particularly where some of our vulnerable communities are going to be most impacted.
Great. All right. We have a mover that this report be received. A seconder and Councillor Mahuta. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. All right. Boy, home stretch, people. Home stretch. We've got item 8 and 9 ahead of us. We're on the regional growth management update. This is page 73 in your agenda. And we have Miffy. Welcome.
Kia ora tātou.
Nice. It's so nice there's so many real life people all in the same room today.
You might not be able to hear me though. I work on that.
All right. Who wants to go first?
Madam Chair, this is an opportunity to update council on some of the growth that's going ahead in the region. So hopefully you've read the report. Hopefully the report that we just talked about, you're thinking about how do we marry the National Adaptation Plan with regional growth management. We had conversations around liability, and if you've built in some of these areas in 5 years, all I'm saying is there is a lot of growth happening. There are a lot of pressures against that growth, and of course we're at the nexus of managing both. Over to you, Miffy.
Great. Okay, so I'll take the report as read, but just I guess the couple of key things is that the future-proof strategy is being updated. There's been some delays because central government keep throwing new things at us. So the strategy deliberations have been pushed out till June. That then in turn pushes back our plan change to the regional policy statement, which is reflecting the national policy statement for urban development requirements, but also updating the future-proof strategy components that are in the regional policy statement. So any further delays will again push out the timeframe for that plan change. So you will be getting the plan is for the strategy to be endorsed by the future-proof the Future-Proof Implementation Committee in June, and then it'll be reported to each of the councils. So you'll get to see that probably in July. Manamara Piako District Council has now rejoined Future-Proof, so they will be included in the next strategy. The Metro Spatial Plan Transport Program business case. I've got a little update in the report. You will be getting a briefing on this prior to it being taken to the Future-Proof Implementation Committee for endorsement, and then it'll come to councils for adoption. So I think we're looking at June for that briefing. And yeah, as I said, our plan change is being a little bit delayed. So there are a number of other councils working on growth at the moment, particularly Waipa, Hamilton City and Waikato all have to notify plan changes for their intensification under the MPSUD by August. So there's a lot of stuff happening, but other TAs around the region are also working on growth planning. So there's a lot coming up.
All right. Are there any questions for Miffy?
I have a comment.
That's okay.
There's reference in the report relating to the Thames spatial plan, and I think it also comes up in the next item relating to submissions and so on. Just a note of concern around that. I think the spatial plan has been motivated by the fact that there may need to be managed retreat from Thames and the Thames coast. So where does that growth occur? But the further out from Thames you go, then the more ribbon development and the sort of sleepyhead type issues that arise. So I think in terms of council's response, we need to be aware of those sort of issues, like, you know, if there's to be some growth out that way, you know, is there a sense of community? Is there a town? Are the shops and schools? Or do people have to commute back into Thames or Pyro or Ngāti or whatever? And then there's the whole issue around emissions that you're just adding to those transport emission issues. So I think something that we as a regional council with that regional perspective need to take into account.
Yes, yep. Through you, Chair, we at staff have provided initial feedback and will be continuing to be involved through the process. So we'll keep putting that regional perspective forward.
Councillor McPherson.
Thank you, Chair. If we don't understand this language that says regional councils, capital R, capital C, have a key function to ensure there is sufficient development capacity for housing and business land to meet expected demands. What does that mean? Sufficient development capacity for housing and business land? Why do you say regional councils juxtapose that comment?
So under the Resource Management Act, we have a responsibility to do so, and the National Policy Statement for Urban Development puts that in, provides more context around that, and gives us criteria how we determine what is sufficient and what sort of capacity we need to be providing. So we, as a regional council, need to work with particularly our high growth areas to make sure that that land is being made available. So that the regional policy statement is directing that and allowing that to occur, and that the TAs are actually identifying that land and rezoning it and making it available. So
can I just ask a subsequent question then? Does that mean, in relation to what you've just said, regional councils in relation to the TAs around the place, is there a hierarchy, or it's not an arm wrestle? Is it an arm wrestle, or is it a true kanohi ki te kanohi and come to a mutual understanding?
We do try and work very collaboratively with our TAs. Future Proof is a good example of that. We, as a partnership, trying to look at the sub-region cohesively and look where the demand is, and look at providing it across the region rather than each council within that high growth area just doing their bit. It doesn't always work smoothly, but we generally work fairly well together. With the smaller councils where there's not as much growth, we more just provide support when they need it.
That's answered it. Okay, the one thing I was just going to say is if you said we have a statutory responsibility for the regional integration of land use and infrastructure. Territorial authorities don't have that. So as Miffy said, we essentially have an umbrella that facilitates across them to make sure their growth is integrated in a more regionally connected way than perhaps if they were doing growth individually. It is the genesis of why Future Proof was developed, to get some people in a room and plan things at a sub-regional level. We have that responsibility, and it comes through our RPS, which we as a regional council and each of the district and city councils must have regard for it too. And Miffy's just put through in the last 4 months the plan change to the RPS that's come through this council, this committee and council to sign that off.
So can I just, Chair, through you, so does that mean we could find ourselves in a position where we say, we really think you should consider a growth cell there, and the territorial authority could say, not going to happen?
In theory, yes. However, practically, we've worked through this quite extensively, particularly with the Future Proof sub-region, quite extensively. We've thrashed around, and when I say we, I haven't, but Miffy definitely has thrashed around what's called priority development areas, because we don't want it to be a lolly scramble. We know what happens when things rub against that, and the effort that, again, Miffy has put into ensuring we get good regional planning. So in theory, yes, but we try to achieve that as much as possible.
Councillor Remington.
Got to be careful as you get older not to be sarcastic, but is that how this good planning works? When it's Councillor Hodge and I go to a kind of online meeting and on future proof, and then we find this kind of backdoor kind of proposal to have the Ohinawai kind of development. That's not good regional planning. It doesn't seem any cooperation in that matter between the territorial authorities and ourselves. I mean, it was just appalling. And Katarina and I had to take the brunt of it, but at least the result we got, at least we got reasonable public transport and some decent kind of outcomes of what originally the proposal was going to be. But I just, look, planning's very important, but I just think more cooperation and trust between the TLAs and the Regional Council must be kind of welcome and applauded.
Thank you for that. All right, we have a suggested motion there. Do I have a mover and a seconder of that? Councillor Mahuta and seconded by Councillor Strange. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Carried. All right, last one, everybody. Number 9. And Miffy's still in the hot seat.
Still me.
The submissions summary update.
Okay.
Is there any particular item you would like to focus our attention on?
There are just
a few. Ask for any questions?
There are just a couple of new things that have happened since we wrote the report, as always. So there is, so the Transport Minister has launched a New Zealand Freight and Supply Chain Issues paper. So that consultation is open on that till the 3rd of June. So our Transport Directorate are having a look at that one. But it is just an issues paper at this point, rather than any proposed legislative change. The Water Services Bill was given royal assent on the 10th of April. So this Act comes into force on the earlier of a date appointed by the Governor-General by Order in Council, or 2 years from royal assent. So 2 years at the latest. So that Act looks very similar to the original bill, and unfortunately none of our submission points seem to have been picked up in through that process. The infrastructure strategy was released yesterday, so we did do quite a comprehensive submission on that, and generally the recommendations, what ended up in the strategy is similar to the key themes of our submission, so that's good. The latest State and Environment report was released on the 14th of April, so it shows improvements in some areas but continued reduction in many aspects of environmental quality with consequences for human health and wellbeing. So there's, I won't go through the detail on that, but particularly highly productive land reduced by 54% between 2002 and 2019. So that's obviously something of concern to our region. And we have been advised that the National Policy Statement on Highly Productive Land is likely to finally be gazetted in June. Waikato District Council has released their district plan review for feedback prior to formal notification. So staff are reviewing that and will provide some comments, and then you'll see it once it comes out for once it's publicly notified. And the final thing, the Horizons Regional Public Transport Plan is out for consultation. A staff submission will be prepared on that given the timeframes. The only thing we're seeking is inclusion of a reference for a cross-boundary DHB service running between Hamilton and Tauranui.
Nice. Did you want to make another or a couple of comments?
Just 2 comments, Madam Chair. Drawing members' attention to page 80, which is a diagram which lets you know what's going on in your constituent councils. That may be useful to you for the months ahead. And also just in respect of the Natural Hazards and Insurance Bill submission we will be making, that will be going to a submission subcommittee next week. So councillors will see that shortly. Again, we'd like to line everything up together, but the timing of these things is not do that. And with the highly productive land MPS, we are imploring Ministry for the Environment to please have had a look through their NES on freshwater so that we are not having challenges as we are having in other spaces.
Nice, thank you. Just with regard to the picture on page 80, so like, for instance, in the Waikato constituency, I see the WDC solid waste bylaw, but I don't necessarily see commentary.
Madam Chair, we don't submit to everything, to be fair. The guys have, the team has got such a workload this year, and we do have a drafting gate, particularly highlighted at a regional level first. I do think we actually made some comments on that, Miffy, probably last year, so.
Yes.
Might just.
So the key has, we have current and past. So the ones that are in the bold colour are current ones, and the ones that are in the faded colour, I guess in the white with just the coloured boundary are the past ones. So they're ones that we've already submitted on. So we can tweak that to make that more obvious if you like.
Oh, it's just, so are you saying the solid waste bylaw is current or past?
Past. We did submit on that last year.
Okay.
So, Madam Chair, perhaps we'll just focus on what's on our books at the moment and what's coming up. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Because I just went looking.
Yeah.
Hard to find. Awesome. Councillor Tech.
Yeah, look, this is loosely related to submissions, but the government has clearly foreshadowed in the upcoming budget that they're going to concentrate on emission reduction actions, climate change. And we had a great deal of success during COVID in terms of shovel-ready projects. We geared up, really quickly and I got some really good projects through. I'm just wondering whether the directorate have sort of been thinking ahead about what might come in that space, and are we similarly gearing up to, get applications in if there's funding opportunities there in the climate space? Because that budget's not that far away.
I'll take that as a note. Personally, no, because I've had a few other things keeping me busy.
Right.
But it's something that we have talked about at the executive table in passing, but we haven't really dedicated a lot of thought to it. But I'll take that as a note, Councillor Tech. Yep.
All right, we have a mover and a seconder that the report be received. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Sweet. Well done, everybody. We'll declare the meeting closed at 1:14 p.m. And I do believe there is lunch. I think we're still brown bagging it, though.